Hey everybody. Today I want to talk about my recent experiments with mineralizing my water and the various substrates I use to accomplish that, and basically what I found out through those experiments. And it's honestly not a lot to talk about. I didn't do a wide variety of different substrates. I really basically just tried the poultry grit, which is a combination of crushed oyster shells and crushed aragonite coral. And when I bought that, I originally meant to get oyster shells because that's what it's listed at on the package. I didn't realize it had the crushed coral in there. I was going to use oyster shells, I was going to use the crushed coral separately, and then I was going to use ground chicken eggshells. My preference is eggshells, and we'll get to why my preference is eggshells in a few minutes. But my preference for mineralizing my water is using the eggshells. So when I wound up getting the poultry grit, I found out that it was already a mixture of the oyster shells and the aragonite coral. And the reason I wanted to try them separately is because they dissolve into the water at different rates. And oyster shells dissolve very, very slowly, whereas the aragonite dissolves pretty rapidly. I found out that the eggshells dissolve somewhere in between. They're still fairly rapid, but they're not as rapid as the aragonite. The aragonite really has an immediate impact on your water. The other thing I tried that we're not even going to bother talking about was garden limestone. I actually got some lime that you're supposed to sprinkle in your garden if your soil's too acidic and you want to bring your pH up a little bit, and that basically just made muddy water. It really impacted, the pH immediately, but it also made muddy water. It turned to like this mushy clay stuff at the bottom of the container I was using. Very quickly learned that using that was not an option. But I did consider it because one of my concerns is that I'm not just trying to add calcium, and I'm not just trying to add the carbonates. And when you use aragonite coral, for example, crushed coral, that's all you're really adding, is you're adding calcium carbonate. And what I wanted to add was calcium and magnesium. And if you use dolomite limestone, what makes dolomite limestone dolomite is the fact that it's about 50-50 between magnesium carbonate and calcium carbonate. And so if you're using the dolomite limestone, you're actually putting a significant amount of magnesium in the water. But you really don't need a lot of magnesium. Whenever you look at a CalMag solution or something, it's always a lot of calcium compared to how much magnesium you're using. So I don't need a lot of magnesium. So the dolomite lime would not necessarily be a good way to go either, because it's a 50-50 calcium to magnesium. So again, this brings me back to your basic things that we would typically use in an aquarium, which would be the oyster shells or the aragonite coral. So I tested between the eggshells, I tested with the coral, the poultry grit, like I said, it had the oyster shells in there, but it was basically the aragonite coral is what was doing all the work in this example. So we don't really even need to think about the oyster shells in this situation. It was the aragonite coral. So you can think about it like that. I was using crushed coral for one test, and I was using the eggshell for another test. And what I found was they both raise the pH to about the same level. It tops out around 7.6, maybe 7.8. Again, it gets a little funny when you start getting into that high end of the low range pH. When you use the API test kit, it's got a low range for pHs around neutral or lower, and then it's got a high range for stuff that's sort of above that mid-neutral, mid-sevens and up. But when you get to the top end of the low range, or you're at the bottom end of the high range, those colors get a little, again, sort of hard to read, and you're kind of guesstimating where it sits. So I don't know exactly where the pH was stabilizing when I was using the aragonite and the eggshells, but it looked like it was coming out around the upper sevens. I don't think I ever got to a pH of 8, and that was after days of just letting aragonite coral sit in a glass of water. So I mean, it was a high volume of coral compared to the water, and it still never really got the pH above 7.8. And that's good. That's what I want. I don't want a pH any higher than 7.8. Ideally, I wouldn't want to go above 7.6, but I can tolerate 7.8. So the aragonite is a good option, but it changes the water chemistry really quickly. If you did a water change and you had a fair amount of aragonite in your tank, if you lowered your pH, it would bounce right back up. And I don't know if that's good or bad, honestly. If you lower the pH and it bounces right back up, is that better for the fish than if you lower the pH and then have it slowly come back up over the next day or so? I honestly don't know which one would be better, just getting it over with and bouncing it real quick down and back up, or bouncing it down fast and then slowly bringing it back up. Again, not sure which is going to be more of an impact. The idea, hopefully, is not to do a big enough water change that much of a pH shift is going to make any difference, whether it's fast, slow, or whatever. It's just not going to make a difference. And that's what I'm shooting for. And that's why I'm trying to use these substrates that don't radically affect my water. I don't want a substrate of coral in my tank. I want enough coral in my tank that it's going to give me some mineralization. It's going to give me some carbonates without pushing it all the way up to the as high as it will go. I don't want it to stabilize at 7.6. I want it to mineralize the water enough that I'm still, you know, the tannin, the CO2, the acidity of the tank is going to be constantly combating the buffers that I'm putting in there. And I want that to find some sort of balance without going all the way up to like maximum buffer. So that's my goal. And so far I've found that I can do that with using small amounts of the aragonite, or I can do it using eggshells. And that's why I like eggshells. Now is why we're going to talk about eggshells, and pretty much we're done with the idea of using the aragonite. I used it, it works. I can put a little bit in the pouches. I can put them in my canister filters on some of my larger tanks. That's a good effective way to do it on my larger tanks. But on my smaller tanks and even my large tanks, which, you know, there's no reason I can't do this in my large tanks too, using the eggshells is just so much easier and, in my opinion, better. For one, it buffers the water more slowly, so if you do bounce it down, the eggshells are going to slowly bring the pH back up. They're going to stabilize around 7.6 to maybe again 7.8, not really sure where that upper end is going to stabilize. So if you do use them and you stabilize the water at its maximum buffering capacity, you're still not going to make the water really hard. It's only going to be 7.6 pH. I never got above about 6 degrees of general hardness by doing this. But the eggshells are free if you eat eggs. And if you don't eat eggs, I'm sure you can go to a local diner or restaurant and ask them for some eggshells and they'll give you eggshells. So eggshells are free, readily available. You can crush them up into, I grind them up into like a sandy kind of consistency. It's not a powder, but it's ground eggshells. You can do that in a coffee grinder, you can do it in a blender. I personally prefer the old tactile sensation of using a mortar and pestle and just grinding it up until it's like the consistency of sand. You can then throw it in the tank, and if you've got substrate like this, that's actually a loose sort of gravelly substrate, that stuff will just work its way down into the substrate and you never even see it in the tank. You don't have to have something visually in your tank to be impacting the water. So the eggshells just go in the tank, they disappear, they're free, and in addition to giving me all the calcium and the carbonate I need, they also give me sulfur, magnesium carbonate, manganese, I'm not sure what that was, manganese, molybdenum, zinc. You get a lot of good stuff when it comes to eggshells. Eggshells are 95% calcium carbonate, but it's the 5% that is all the good stuff. Like I said, you get the sulfur, you get manganese, zinc, molybdenum, you get all kind of stuff that your tank needs or your fish would need as trace minerals. Your plants need these things as trace nutrients, and so it's just a good idea to add them to the tank. Now, I will say, I don't know that with a little bit, you know, putting a couple tablespoons of ground eggshells in there, it's maybe the equivalent of 3 or 4 eggshells ground up into, let's say, a 40-gallon tank. Is that really adding enough molybdenum, for example, you know, to have an impact on the plants or the fish? Am I putting enough zinc in there that the fish are really going to be able to use that zinc? I honestly don't know. I would tend to say probably not. It's only a little tiny bit that I'm putting in the water, but I'm putting it in the water. At least it's there with the eggshells. It doesn't even exist in the aragonite. So if I'm putting aragonite in the tank, I know I'm not putting any molybdenum or zinc or sulfur or any of the other stuff. I'm not putting any magnesium, nothing. So with the eggshells, at least it's there. At least I know that there's some magnesium going into the water. There's some zinc and sulfur and so on and so forth going into the water. So at the end of the day, it's free. it becomes more or less invisible when you put it in the tank. It just settles down into the tank and you just never see it. You could even put it in your filter if you wanted. You can leave the eggshells whole and just put it, smash them down and put them in your filter. If anybody's interested in how I prepare my eggshells and what I do with all the, whether I peel the membrane out, whether I boil them or bake them or all the other different things you can read about online, let me know if anybody's interested and I'll do a video about how I actually prepare them and use them. So on and so forth, about the eggshells. But that's kind of the long and short of my experiments with, mineralizing my water and everything. I found out that the aragonite does a fine job, but it's limited. It works really quickly, but all you're really getting out of it is a little bit of calcium carbonate, and you're not really getting a whole lot of other minerals to go with that. And again, it's a really, really rapid way of affecting your water. You don't need a lot of it at all. So it's a viable solution, but for me, end of the day, eggshells are just going to be the way to go because they're cheap, they're easy, and I've already explained all the benefits of why I think they're worth using. So there you go. Let me know whether you want to see any more videos about how I prepare the eggshells, etc. And I'll also do a video, if anybody's interested, if you're still watching, on the pH levels. And I've been doing tests where I've put in two colors side by side, and I've watched the color change so you can compare the high range to the low range. As the pH slowly climbs, you can see the color changes of both tests side by side and see how that shift occurs. And for me, it gave me a lot better understanding of how those colors change once you get above neutral. Between 7 and 8, which is where most of our aquariums probably sit, the colors on those API, pH test kits are funny. And so if anybody's interested in seeing me do a video about that, let me know, and I can always sit down and we can do another video over, my washing machine looking at colored vials and tinkering with that. I know a lot of people love those videos. So anyway, we're gonna call that good for this one. I'm gonna say thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget, this one here is my 125 gallon tank. Thanks for watching, and I will see you real soon in the next one.